And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Somewhere, a story begins where fire speaks before humans do. The flame does not symbolize, it orders. This myth, older than record, organizes the world through what burns and what resists, what transforms and what remains. It does not seek meaning, it arranges it. Before the first voice, there is division, and before division, there is structure. But whose? The myth suggests an origin, but it also performs a pattern. Heat against cold, wild against tamed, visible against concealed. These are not metaphors, they are operations. And the question is not whether they are true, but what kind of mind needs them. Claude Lévi-Strauss saw in stories like this the evidence of an unconscious architecture, one that transcended geography, language, and time. He looked at myths not as inventions, but as patterns repeated with eerie fidelity across difference, raw and cooked, nature and culture, life and death. These oppositions, he argued, were not cultural artifacts, but cognitive constants, the building blocks of thought itself. If fire speaks, it does so not because of context, but because of contrast. Meaning, in this view, does not emerge. It is selected from a limited palette of opposites already inscribed in the human brain. There is something arresting in the elegance of this theory. It flatters the mind's desire for coherence, a universal code beneath the noise, a grammar beneath the ritual. It tells us that despite all our cultural divergence, we think the same. Structure as salvation, pattern as peace. This is the seduction of oppositional logic, not that it simplifies, but that it promises unity where there was once only contingency. But the myth returns, and it resists. Its fire does not illuminate a binary. It devours it. The story does not explain the world. It absorbs it. And this is the friction. If structure explains myth, what explains the residue that structure cannot account for? What about the noise, the break, the recursive pulse that repeats but never settles? The binary begins to bend, the oppositions flicker, something else, neither raw nor cooked, emerges. The mind that needs oppositions is not wrong, but perhaps it is incomplete. Perhaps it seeks structure not because it is universal, but because it is afraid of what comes without it. If the story began with fire, maybe it ends with ash, something diffuse, scattered, ungraspable. And maybe the ash is not the opposite of fire, but its echo, the remainder of meaning after structure has burned away. The idea that human cognition craves symmetry has always carried a certain aesthetic weight. Lévi-Strauss did not invent the impulse to organize thought through opposition. He merely gave it a system, a lineage, a theoretical armature, and in doing so he transformed myth into data. What had once functioned as spiritual sediment, opaque, narrative, alive, was rendered legible through structural extraction. This was not desecration. It was devotion. To decode was to honor. But the cost of such decoding is never neutral. To render structure visible is to make context disappear. Oppositional logic, as Lévi-Strauss conceived it, did not merely describe thought, it governed it. It was recursive, self-affirming, and clean. The myths of one tribe mirrored those of another, not in content but in architecture, and that architecture was the point. Difference, then, was never difference, it was variation on a theme built from dichotomies that the mind could not help but return to. There is a deep comfort in this model. It suggests that beneath history, beneath language, beneath rupture, there is pattern, and where there is pattern, there is safety, or so it seems. But a model that absorbs all difference into sameness becomes its own kind of erasure. What begins as analysis risks becoming ontology. Culture in this system is no longer dynamic but illustrative. Myths do not move, they demonstrate. Kinship is not lived, it is diagrammed. The ritual becomes the artifact of cognition rather than a site of lived tension. In the structuralist gaze, particularity becomes noise. What matters is what repeats. Still, repetition is not innocence. What repeats may be trauma, may be power, may be exclusion. A binary does not name only a contrast. It implies hierarchy, constraint, refusal. Male, female, nature, culture, raw, cooked. These are not merely coordinates of thought. They are tools, sometimes weapons, and the structures they build are not only in the mind, they are in the world. To treat them as neutral is to forget what they enforce. Yet the appeal of oppositional thinking remains. It reduces complexity to shape. It gives the illusion of symmetry where there may only be damage. Lévi-Strauss offered us a theory not of culture but of comfort, a map that hides the terrain it claims to chart, and still the map remains seductive. Even now, there is a part of thought that wants to believe if it can be divided, it can be known. If it is structured, it is safe. But safety in this architecture comes at a price. To impose opposition where ambiguity breathes is not to clarify, it is to constrain. Somewhere in the grammar of structuralism is an unspoken fear that meaning without division might collapse into the formless. Lévi-Strauss did not argue this directly, but his insistence on binary foundations reveals it. Beneath his catalogue of myths, kinship charts, and cognitive structures lies a philosophical anxiety, one that confuses recurrence with truth and symmetry with depth. This anxiety is not his alone. It echoes through disciplines that have inherited his scaffolding. Linguistics, psychoanalysis, narratology all have drawn from his oppositional logic, often without questioning its violence, because there is violence in reduction. When one says that all myths resolve the same structural tension, what becomes of the myth that refuses resolution? What becomes of the story that fragments, reverses, or simply ends in silence? Structuralism cannot metabolize rupture, it can only diagram it, and so the first cracks begin to show. The universalist premise, once bold and elegant, becomes brittle under scrutiny. Critics emerge, not only from the fringes, but from within the very frameworks Lévi-Strauss influenced. Feminist scholars, post-colonial theorists, existentialists, each interrogates the cost of his clarity. Jean-Paul Sartre in particular becomes a structural irritant. His existentialism, shaped by contingency and freedom, rejects the idea that cognition is passively patterned. For Sartre, to exist is to choose, to rupture structure, not to inhabit it. But the critique is not only philosophical, it is historical. Structuralism presumes a mind untouched by power, untouched by history. It speaks of myths without colonizers, of kinship without empire, of opposition without domination. This is not innocence, it is omission, and the omission accumulates. Over time, the elegant theory becomes a screen, obscuring the social violence it cannot register. Still, the structure persists. It persists because it organizes, because it simplifies, because in a world that disorients, pattern feels like control. But the world resists being diagrammed. And the mind, for all its patterning, is not only a machine of oppositions, it is also an organ of rupture. It forgets, it dreams, it contradicts itself. In this space of contradiction, structuralism begins to fray. The binary, once firm, begins to echo, not with meaning, but with refusal. A refusal to resolve, a refusal to be arranged. It is in this refusal that a deeper tension begins to surface, not between myths or cultures, but within the theory itself. Structuralism, which once promised a universal grammar of thought, now reveals its exclusions. What it cannot register, it erases. What it cannot predict, it pathologizes. This is not a flaw of method, it is a symptom of its foundation. Binary logic does not merely miss nuance, it forbids it. And yet, the world persists in being nuanced, layered, unstable. The very phenomena structuralism seeks to explain exceed its form. Consider the myth that reverses its own premise halfway through, the story that begins with order and ends in ambiguity, that names no hero and offers no resolution. Structuralism might still chart its oppositions, but it cannot feel the collapse they enact. It cannot inhabit the space between poles, the murky terrain where meaning is not yet decided. This is where post-structuralism begins, not as opposition but as leak. As the logic of structure begins to fray, something unstructured slips through. Not chaos, but a different order, one built not on symmetry, but on relation, on difference that cannot be mapped. Here, thinkers like Derrida and Foucault do not simply criticize Lévi-Strauss, they dissolve his coordinates. Derrida's difference is not an alternative structure, it is the undoing of structure's authority. Foucault's power-knowledge matrix does not sit outside structuralism. It reveals what it silences. These interventions are not rejections, they are hauntings. Structuralism becomes a ghost, visible in outline, but hollowed from within. And yet Lévi-Strauss's project remains deeply human. It is not wrong to seek pattern. It is not foolish to search for a shared cognitive rhythm. But what begins as shared understanding can too easily become intellectual colonialism. To name all cultures as variations of the same unconscious code is to erase their specificity in the act of recognition. The gesture may be inclusive, but the logic is extractive. Still, even now, one feels the pull of structure, the desire for something beneath chaos, a signal beneath noise. This desire is not intellectual. It is psychic. It emerges when meaning slips, when stories contradict themselves, when nothing holds. And structuralism, despite its collapse, still promises that something might. But what if its collapse is not failure, but release? What if the structure breaks not to end, but to open? At the edge of that opening, another kind of story begins. One that does not arrange itself in opposites or settle into resolution. It moves sideways, loops back, leaves absences where meaning should be. These are not errors, they are gestures. A myth where the protagonist dissolves halfway through, or where the categories blur, man and God, wild and domestic, living and dead. Structuralism sees these as deviations. But perhaps they are signals of another logic, one that refuses symmetry not because it is chaotic, but because it is attuned to rupture. This is where feminist and post-colonial critiques do more than challenge Lévi-Strauss. They reorient the ground. They ask not just what structures exist, but who benefits from them. Gender is not a neutral axis of opposition. It is a site of power, of inscription, of recursive harm. To frame kinship systems as structures without acknowledging their violence is to misread their function entirely. The male-female opposition is not merely cognitive, it is historical. And in many societies, it is enforced through absence, the silencing of women, the disappearance of queerness, the normalization of hierarchy. Post-colonial thought presses this further. The very act of naming a culture's myth as structure often occurs under the shadow of empire. Structuralism gathers its material from colonized spaces, then abstracts it into universal form. The particular is translated, flattened and returned as theory, but the translation is not clean. It carries the residue of domination. The myth does not speak, it is spoken for, and what remains is not understanding but appropriation dressed in analysis. These critiques are not external to the system, they are the system's echo, its internal fracture made audible. They do not destroy structuralism, they reveal what it cannot metabolize: power, context, history, embodiment, all the things that resist diagram. The structuralist frame, once seen as objective, begins to shimmer with omission, and in that shimmer something else becomes possible. Because refusal is not nihilism, it is a method. To refuse the binary is not to abandon meaning, but to seek it differently. To ask what happens when a myth contradicts itself, or when a kinship system breaks its own rule. These are not failures of structure, they are revelations of complexity, and in complexity a new structure begins, not one of oppositions, but of echoes, gradients and unresolved chords. Something not yet named, but already felt. The structure that emerges from this complexity is not architecture, but atmosphere. It does not segment meaning, it suspends it. A myth does not resolve, but reverberate. A kinship system does not clarify roles, but foregrounds the instability of relation itself. These are not errors to be corrected by deeper analysis. They are the form truth takes when it refuses to be neat. Lévi-Strauss, in Seeking Universal Grammar, offered a scaffold, but culture is not a building. It is weather, patterned, yes, but mutable, relational, shaped by pressure and change. In this space, the binary fades, not because it is untrue, but because it is insufficient. There are stories that resist clean oppositions, rituals that do not map onto raw and cooked, male and female, life and death. There are narratives built from rupture, not repetition. These are not marginal. They are foundational in their refusal. They ask a different kind of question, not what something is, but what it disrupts. This disruption cannot be plotted, it must be inhabited. A story where a woman becomes a river does not merely invert a binary, it dissolves the category of subject altogether. A myth where time moves backward is not illogical, it is ontologically foreign. Structuralism might note these as anomalies, but they are not anomalies, they are epistemologies. To live within them is to accept that meaning may never settle, that coherence is not always a virtue, that sometimes to think clearly is to think askew. Silence begins to enter. Not the silence of omission, but of pressure. A silence that does not end a sentence but holds it open. The kind of silence that lives between concepts. This is where the binary cannot follow. And it is here that structuralism ends, not with refutation but with abandonment. The map no longer fits the terrain. The opposition no longer explains the tension. Something else is needed. Perhaps not a new theory, perhaps not a system at all, just a willingness to dwell in pattern that flickers, in meaning that recurs without resolving. This is not the negation of structure, it is its diffusion, its slow generative dispersal into something looser, stranger, more alive. In the gap, structuralism leaves other logic surface, not to replace it, but to reframe its silence as signal. A theory that ends not with clarity, but with the possibility of something else. Something else, not clarity, not system, not even critique. What remains after the binary dissolves is not emptiness, it is breath. The slow exhale of meaning unbound from architecture. We return not to Lévi-Strauss, but to the myth. Not to extract its structure, but to feel its resistance, its refusal to be diagrammed, its insistence on being more than the logic that interprets it. The myth still speaks, but now its grammar stutters, bends, leaks. And in the leakage, something like truth begins, not as proposition, but as rhythm. The story of fire that once organized the world now flickers in reverse. It no longer names what is raw or cooked. It reveals what is burned, what is absent, what is no longer speakable. The binary has failed, but the story remains. What does it mean to listen now? Not to decode, but to receive. Not to locate pattern, but to feel dissonance. This is not an anti-structuralism. It is post-shelter. The recognition that the mind may crave form, but the world often withholds it. The theoretical impulse to find symmetry must now confront the lived experience of fracture. The kinship chart collapses under the weight of non-binary bodies, diasporic ruptures, histories that do not resolve into lineage but into loss. Structuralism cannot account for the ghost, the exile, the child who refuses role. It cannot chart what will not name itself. This is not its failure. It is its limit. Every limit once touched can be refigured as aperture. We do not conclude here. We pause inside the unresolved. What if the myth was never meant to be understood? What if its purpose was to mark the place where sense breaks down? Structuralism gave us tools, but perhaps their value lies in what they cannot grasp. The moment the pattern begins to fray, the interval between opposites where nothing quite fits, that interval is not void, it is invitation. So we end not with a theory, but with a gesture, a return to the story altered now. The fire still burns, but no longer instructs. It pulses, it withdraws. It leaves behind not structure, but residue. Something charred, unsettled, conceptually illegible. And in that residue we listen again, not for order but for the sound thought makes when it no longer needs to explain itself. There is no final structure, only the impulse to build one. This is what remains after theory exhausts itself, the echo of its attempt, the outline of its disappearance. Lévi-Strauss gave us a method to trace the architecture of thought, and in doing so revealed its deepest vulnerability, the need to enclose, to resolve, to diagram meaning as if it was stable. But meaning, like myth, resists that frame. It flickers. It withdraws. It moves backward through logic and forward into rupture. We return to the myth now altered by recursion. It no longer opens with fire but with the absence of flame, a world before division. No raw, no cooked, no oppositions to scaffold the story. And yet meaning still forms, not in contrast but in accumulation, in gesture, in breath, in pause. A logic that is not logic, a grammar that leans. The myth does not explain, it unsettles. And in that unsettling, it teaches. This is not the end of Lévi-Strauss. It is the dispersal of his frame into something porous. Structuralism dissolves not because it is false, but because the world it sought to describe has outgrown its edges. The categories no longer hold. Culture exceeds its scaffolds. Thought bends past its templates. The very act of seeking a universal logic now feels like an artifact of a time when we mistook pattern for truth. Still, the longing remains. To know, to name, to make sense. But perhaps we begin again, not with oppositions, but with intervals, with spaces between forms, with contradictions held open instead of resolved, with stories that echo without returning. What we inherit from Lévi-Strauss is not the system, it is the impulse to listen and the courage to stop listening once the pattern grows too still. So we do not summarize, we suspend. We leave the map unfinished, the structure broken, the binary dissolved. The myth remains, but it hums now with a different charge. It is not data, it is residue, not theory, terrain. And in that terrain, something quietly emerges. not coherence but contact, not clarity but relation. Thought, no longer scaffolded, still moves, and that movement, uneven, recursive, unresolved, is enough. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.